1890. Location: the North Sea off the Scottish coast. A thick fog draped itself over the water like a burial shroud. The lighthouse on Eilean Mòr, one of the desolate Flannan Isles, blinked weakly through the mist, its beam fractured by salt and wind. On a storm-beaten December morning, a relief boat arrived, carrying three men whose task was simple: deliver supplies, rotate the keepers, and ensure the light stayed burning. But what they found that day would become one of the strangest maritime mysteries ever recorded. As the men rowed ashore, the island was silent. No signal flags, no movement. The door to the lighthouse stood ajar. Inside, the fire was cold, a meal half eaten, chairs overturned as if someone had left in a hurry. Coats thick, essential garments for survival hung neatly on their pegs. And yet, the keeper's three experienced men had vanished without a trace. The year was 1890, a time when superstition still clung to the edges of reason. Locals whispered that the island had always been cursed, that ancient bones lay buried beneath the turf, and that sometimes, on moonless nights, the sea carried voices calling for those who dared to stay too long. In the decades that followed, official records would describe what happened here as an unexplained disappearance. But hidden among the lighthouse logs, archived letters, and one strange personal journal lies evidence that something far darker was at play, something history quietly erased. Tonight, we reopen the file on the abandoned island of 1890 and follow the fragments left behind. Because this was more than a maritime tragedy, it was a warning written in salt, secrecy, and madness. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The late 19th century was an age of industrial progress, but also one of isolation. Islands like Eilean Mòr were remote outposts, manned by men who spent weeks, sometimes months, cut off from the mainland. The duty was vital: keep the light alive, to guide ships through the deadly currents below. But for every storm survived, there were whispers of those who did not return, whole men who spoke of strange chants beneath the wind, or footsteps echoing from the cliffs long after nightfall. The island itself was a slab of basalt, wind-scarred and treeless, rising abruptly from the sea. There was no harbor, only jagged rocks and a narrow stair cut into the cliff. On that frozen morning in December, the relief crew found evidence of violence disguised as absence: deep gouges in the ground, a broken rail by the landing path, and a logbook entry that stopped mid-sentence. The final note in the keeper's hand read, "Is greater than the storm persists. Seas like living beasts." James says he hears them again singing beneath the waves. This single line, dismissed for decades as delirium, would later reappear in unrelated maritime journals from the same period. Different ships, same waters, same words. There was the first clue, an echo stretching across time, hinting that the disappearances of 1890 were not random nor singular. They belonged to a pattern the Crown itself sought to conceal. And so our journey begins not with the men who vanished, but with the records that should have never been found. In the archives of Edinburgh's Maritime Office, sealed beneath obsolete correspondence, researchers in the 1,950 seconds discovered something peculiar. Three censored letters dated November 1890, a month before the incident. Each was addressed to a man named Thomas Marshall, the senior keeper. The letters were unsigned, their ink fading but still legible. They warned him not to stay through the winter rotation. Is greater than the island does not rest. One read, "You have seen the mark. Leave before the third moon." The mark, at first thought to be a sailor's superstition, appears in multiple accounts, a symbol etched into the lighthouse's foundation stone, resembling a coiled serpent devouring its tail. To modern historians, it's an ancient motif known as the Ouroboros, but the version carved on Eilean Mòr had a second line of runic script beneath it, Old Norse letters translating roughly to "the dead returns." By 1890, this place had already accumulated a dark reputation. Shipwrecks clustered unnaturally near its shores, and more than one rescue attempt ended in tragedy. Locals refused to approach after sunset. Fishermen claimed that when their nets scraped the seabed near the island, they pulled up fragments of carved bone and twisted metal, unlike any known relic. Yet, for the Scottish Northern Lighthouse Board, superstition was irrelevant. The men stationed there, Marshall, Ducat, and MacArthur, were hardened seafarers. They had survived gales that shattered ships and storms that swallowed coasts, but even experience could not prepare them for what the logbooks revealed in the weeks before they vanished. The entries begin methodically. Is greater than winds strong, visibility fair. Routine maintenance completed. All in order. Then, abruptly, the tone changes. Is greater than James reports voices in the fog cannot locate source. Strange lights observed westward. Not ship signals. Supplies disturbed. Possibly intruder. Each notation is precise, almost clinical, as though the writer were trying to document insanity with logic. Historians later noted that Eilean Mòr lies near an area known to ancient Norse sagas as the Gate of the Drowned, a passage where the sea is said to conceal the ruins of an older civilization. Skeptics dismiss such legends as myth, but local Gaelic oral histories tell of monks who fled the island centuries before, claiming the sea had learned to speak. In the days leading up to the disappearance, storms battered the North Sea relentlessly. Supply lines were cut, communication impossible. The last recorded message from the island, transmitted by lamp code on December 11th, read simply, "Is greater than all well." No further signals were ever received. When the relief crew finally landed days later, what they found defied all logic. The clocks inside the lighthouse had stopped at 9:45. Plates were laid out for dinner, untouched. The kitchen chair was overturned as if someone had stood suddenly. A single diary page, torn, smeared, rested beside the cold hearth. Its final words, "Is greater than they are at the door." At first, investigators blamed the storm. They said the men must have been swept away by rogue waves. But this explanation failed to fit the evidence. For one, the safety ropes required by protocol were found coiled and unused. 2 pairs of boots were missing, but 1 pair remained neatly in place, implying one man had not even attempted to flee. And then there was the door latch, twisted from the inside. If they had all gone outside, who sealed the door behind them? An official inquiry followed, but the report that entered the public record was suspiciously brief, barely 2 pages. Testimonies from the relief crew were altered. The discovery of the rune symbol was omitted entirely. For nearly 60 years, the incident was labeled unsolved. It wasn't until a private historian named Dr. Eleanor Kearney began studying maritime anomalies of the 19th century that the pattern resurfaced. Kearney, a scholar of folklore and oceanic archaeology, noticed that other islands across the North Sea reported identical vanishing, same decade, same month, always during the winter solstice. Her research would later uncover a missing section of the lighthouse's original construction ledger. It recorded something omitted from all later diagrams: a sealed lower chamber bricked beneath the tower's foundation containing unmarked relics recovered during excavation. No further description was given, but a single margin note, initialed by an engineer, read, "Is greater than do not open, not ours to disturb." This was the pivot, the point where the case ceased to be a mere disappearance and began to bleed into something older, something ritualistic. What did those men find beneath their tower? And why did the light meant to guide the living become a beacon for something else entirely? The deeper we dig, the more this forgotten island begins to resemble a tomb, one built not to protect treasure, but to imprison something meant never to rise again. In the next part, we'll examine the forbidden records uncovered from the British archives in 1924, the recovered journal of Thomas Marshall's wife, and the disturbing parallels between the island's design and ancient Nordic burial architecture. But before that, ask yourself this. If an island could keep a secret for centuries, what would it sound like when it finally tried to speak? The investigation into the Flannan Isles incident might have ended in silence if not for Dr. Eleanor Kearney, whose obsession with maritime disappearances bordered on the fanatical. In 1924, she uncovered a restricted file in the British Maritime Archives labeled Eilean Mòr non-public materials. It was kept not in the Lighthouse division, but in a section reserved for archaeological containment records, a department that technically shouldn't have had any involvement with Lighthouse operations. Inside the file, Kearney found what the official inquiry had deliberately concealed: fragments of the keeper's logbooks, several black and white photographs taken after the disappearance, and a set of cryptic engineering notes describing an unauthorized excavation beneath the central tower. One of the photographs, damaged by age, showed the interior of the lighthouse's service basement, a cramped stone corridor leading to a sealed arch. On the wall beside it was a symbolic carving, faint but visible under the lamplight. It was the same Ouroboros coil found etched on the foundation stone, but this time the serpent's body had been broken in two, its tail severed, and its jaws open as if screaming. Below it, faintly, were words in Norse runes that Kearney translated as "is greater than when the circle breaks, the drowned shall walk." To the superstitious, it sounded like a curse. To Kearney, it sounded like a warning that had been ignored. The ledger fragment describing the sealed chamber beneath the lighthouse had been dismissed as myth until Kearney located the original contractor's diary in the estate of a deceased builder named Robert Innes. His handwriting was erratic, marked by ink stains and strange diagrams. The diary detailed the discovery made during the lighthouse's construction in 1889, a hollow cavity beneath the island rock, filled with stones arranged in concentric circles and objects that gleamed like wet bone. Innes wrote that the supervising engineer, Andrew MacLeod, ordered the area sealed immediately. He forbade the men from speaking of what they had seen, warning that certain things must remain buried. But Innes, deeply disturbed, recorded that one of the laborers had taken something from the chamber, a small bronze idol shaped like a coiled serpent with hollow eyes. That man, Innes wrote, did not live to see the year's end. He was found washed ashore weeks later, his face distorted as if by drowning, though his lungs were dry. The object was never recovered. Kearney's team reassembled the surviving pages of Thomas Marshall's Lighthouse log, filling in the missing timeline from December 7th to 15th, 1890. The entries paint a gradual descent into fear. Is greater than deck 7. Heavy winds, strange light at horizon. James Restless claims it follows him. Deck 9. Found seals gathered on western slope, all dead. No signs of injury. Air reeks of brine, though tide far below. Deck 11. Heard knocking from under the stairs at 2:30 a.m. No source found. Deck 13. Storm worsening. Voices louder. Can't tell if from outside or within the walls. The final entry simply read, "is greater than deck 15. The light won't stay lit. Something moves below." From the sequence, it was clear the men believed they were not alone. Each day brought escalating paranoia, yet the tone of Marshall's writing remained dispassionate, as though he were trying to reason through terror. When Kearney compared these entries to meteorological data from the same week, she discovered something chilling. The storm that the men described never officially existed. Records from the mainland stations reported clear skies. Whatever they saw, it wasn't a natural tempest. In 1925, Kearney submitted her findings to the British Historical Society. Within weeks, she received a cease notice from the Home Office. claiming her research contained classified materials concerning Crown property. Several of her documents were confiscated, and one of her assistants disappeared under unexplained circumstances. But before she was silenced, Kelly managed to publish one academic paper under a pseudonym in an obscure journal of folklore studies. Its title is Greater Than the Drowned Circle, a study of submerged myth in the Flannan Isles. In it, she proposed that the lighthouse had been built upon the remains of an ancient ritual site used by Norse settlers between the 9th and 11th centuries. Archaeological surveys from nearby islands supported this claim, showing burial mounds aligned with celestial events, particularly the winter solstice. The Flannan structure, Carney argued, was not a new lighthouse, it was an unwitting reconstruction of an ancient temple. The builders had reawakened what the Norse once tried to imprison. Among the relief crew who first discovered the empty lighthouse, two men gave private testimonies years later. Their statements, recovered from personal letters, provide a human window into what the official record refused to acknowledge. The first, Joseph Moore, described the pervasive hum that grew louder as he approached the lighthouse. Is greater than. It was like the earth itself was whispering through the stone. My head rang for hours after. The second, John Mackenzie, spoke of finding footprints bare, human-sized, leading from the lighthouse door toward the cliffs. They ended abruptly at the edge, but there were no drag marks, no scuffing, just perfect impressions pressed into the mud, as though the men had stepped out onto the air itself. Mackenzie also swore he saw something else, a handprint burned into the inner wall of the stairwell. When he touched it, the stone was still warm. Neither man ever returned to the island. Both were dead within 3 years, Moore of pneumonia, Mackenzie in a ship collision off Aberdeen. Through her research, Kearney identified 6 other sites across northern Europe that shared identical disappearance patterns. Remote islands, winter solstice vanishings, and structures built atop prehistoric foundations. Each time, the last written word was eerily similar references to voices beneath the sea or lights that mimic human movement. She hypothesized that these sites were once part of a forgotten maritime network, a system of watchtowers maintained by early seafarers to contain or mark certain points of power, points that should never have been disturbed. In every recorded case, modern structures, churches, forts, or lighthouses had been built unknowingly over these locations, reactivating ancient forces or geological anomalies that defied explanation. The Flannan Isles incident, she believed, was not an isolated tragedy, but the most complete manifestation of an older pattern, a ritual repeating itself through human ignorance. Among Kearney's most haunting discoveries was the revelation that Thomas Marshall had requested a transfer months before the disappearance. His wife, Catherine Marshall, later testified that her husband was tormented by dreams and spoke to the sea as if it could answer. In a private journal found decades later in a family attic, Catherine wrote, "Is greater than," he said, "the island wanted something back. He said we were never meant to build there." On the night he left, he looked at me and said, "If I don't return, tell them to fill the cracks." I asked what cracks. He just said, "the ones beneath the floor." Investigators never examined what lay beneath the floorboards of the keeper's quarters. Why would 3 experienced men, sober, trained, and disciplined, walk willingly into a storm, leaving everything behind? If the natural explanations fail, we must consider the psychological. Isolation is known to unhinge even the strongest minds. But the uniformity of their behavior, the precision of their movements, the missing coats, the sealed door suggests coordination, not chaos. Some theorists argue that the men were drawn into a collective delusion, a shared hallucination induced by infrasound, the low-frequency vibration produced by wind striking the cliffs. It can cause anxiety, nausea, even visions. Yet, this hypothesis crumbles against one detail. the missing boots. Two men prepared to go outside. One did not. Why? If hysteria seized them or equally, the behavior should have been identical. Instead, it appears one man, perhaps Thomas Marshall himself, chose to stay behind, perhaps to seal the door, perhaps to keep something inside. When Kearney traced the lighthouse's blueprints, she noticed that beneath the keeper's quarters, directly below the hearth, lay the unaccounted chamber from the engineer's notes, the forbidden space. Could it be that on that final night, the man descended into that chamber? The story, until now, has been an accumulation of whispers, fragments, and myths. But in the next part, we move into the moment of truth, the reconstruction of the night itself, built from diary evidence, archaeological analysis, and the strange physical remnants found when the site was reopened decades later. Because if the records are to be believed, what those men found beneath the lighthouse wasn't merely a chamber. It was a doorway. The final pieces of this puzzle come together not in the courtroom, but in a dim, wet chamber below the lighthouse, where stone breathes cold and time feels like a wound. Decades after the men vanished, a sanctioned archaeological team working quietly, with Admiralty permission and under the shadow of Dr. Kearney's suppressed papers, returned to Eilean Mòr to reopen what had been bricked up in 1889. What they found turned conjecture into a reconstruction that was chilling in its precision. Under layers of mortar and seawater seared brick lay a circular cavity. Its walls were not random masonry, but an intentional architecture. Concentric stone rings, each set at a slightly different pitch. At the center was a depression large enough to sit a man, lined with a dark, organic residue that chemical analysis later identified as a mixture of whale oil, decomposed kelp, and something proteinaceous that did not match any known local fauna. Around the depression, small artifacts rested in deliberate alignment. Fragments of bone carved into looped shapes, bits of iron coral twisted into fishhook shapes, and in one niche, the hollow-eyed bronze serpent Innes had described. Its eyes were filled with a tar-like substance that smelled faintly of salt and old rot. The chamber's most unsettling feature, however, was a doorway low, framed with basalt slabs and overlaid with the same serpent motif. The runes above it, once translated, read with a formal austerity that made the hair on the neck rise. We bind what takes what is owed. The mortar around the arch bore scratches as if something had tried and failed to claw its way back into the world. Using the surviving fragments of Marshall's log, witness letters, and the physical evidence within the chamber, researchers reconstructed the night of December 15th, 1890 as an event of grim logic. The men had not stumbled into the sea in a panicked flight. Instead, the record suggests coordinated action. On the eve in question, Marshall recorded voices and lights, James noted knocking beneath the stairs, and MacArthur, whose marginal notes displayed a practical, fatalistic streak, had written of a decision. The coiling motif appears repeatedly in the ledger margins, often paired with shorthand references to the circle and the debt. The reconstruction indicates that the three keepers descended willingly into the bricked chamber. Their boots were found near the stairwell. One coat remained on its peg. It appears the two men walked out across the cliff, impressions discovered by Mackenzie, the bare footprints that ended at the edge while one remained below, perhaps to perform a final task. Whether those two leapt, were taken, or simply vanished in some other manner cannot be established beyond reasonable doubt. But the footprint's sudden termination, paired with the lack of drag marks or torn turf, suggests a phenomenon neither fully physical nor purely psychological. Here is the central, unnerving twist. What the excavation revealed points away from a simple haunting and toward an organized attempt to re-establish containment. Among the artifacts was a folded sheet of oiled paper, preserved by tar and peat, on which an older hand had drawn a sequence of marks, a crude ritual map. The map linked the central depression to an arc of stones out on the western slope where, in Marshall's last days, the keepers had reported dead seals arranged unnaturally. The notation indicated that the island had once functioned as a kind of anchor, its stones forming a ring that held something beneath the waves in check. When the modern builders had disturbed that ring in 1889, they had unwittingly loosened the anchor. The three keepers, some models of experience, some perhaps initiated, attempted to restore the ring, to force the anchored thing back into submission. The motive revealed by this evidence is not simple greed or jealousy. It is custodial, tragic, and heavy with ancestral guilt. Thomas Marshall's transfer request, his whispered dreams, his line to Catherine about filling the cracks, all fall into place. He had discovered through local lore or secret documents passed to him that the island's construction sat precariously over a ritual boundary. Whether he alone initiated the plan or whether all three had sworn an oath is impossible to prove. What the chamber shows is that someone acted with intent to perform an ancient rite, one that required sacrifice, bodily placement, and the deliberate use of the lighthouse itself as a cover for an arcane engineering task. The climax of this reconstruction is as stark as it is human. Chemical traces on the hearth above correspond to residues found in the central depression, indicating the use of whale oil and kelp to create a thick, burning smoke, perhaps to mask sound, perhaps to create an olfactory barrier. The arc ritual markings, when analyzed under ultraviolet, revealed faint traces of blood. A small iron pin, corroded but identifiable as a fastening from a service boot, lay in the depression. One human rib, a fragment, rested on the inner lip. The archaeological team concluded that at least one keeper had been physically present in the depression when something happened, either to hold a seal in place or to act as part of the mechanism that bound it. The evidence strongly supports the most painful interpretation. At least one of the men died in the act of containing whatever slumbered beneath the island. When the story of the excavation became public, it rippled through local and scholarly communities with a force that revived both horror and skepticism. Newspapers favored lurid headlines, while scholarly journals debated ritual engineering versus geological anomaly. The Home Office, which had previously moved to suppress Kearney's work, issued cautious statements about maritime heritage and the responsible handling of sensitive historical sites. For some, the pattern across multiple islands suggested a network of ancient practices twisted by time. For others, the find was an unfortunate convergence of superstition, isolation, and tragic miscalculation. Families felt the revelation most keenly. Catherine Marshall's journal, published posthumously by a great-granddaughter who insisted on truth, became the human center of the narrative. Her passages of love, of fear, of a husband haunted by premonitions transformed the abstract into something intimate. Relatives of the other two keepers, long shamed by rumor, finally received proper inquiries and public apologies for the way the official record had obfuscated facts. Yet forgiveness was thin and fragile. Where once there had been a neat, if melancholy, perception of a maritime accident, there was now the heavier knowledge that good men may have been asked to perform an unthinkable duty, and that those who ordered silence did so in the name of a pragmatic cruelty. To prevent panic, to avoid explanations that would unsettle a nation dependent on order at sea. Beyond family and press, the island's reopening changed local behavior. Fishermen who once skirted Eilean Mòr spoke of reticence. Informal rites returned to the shore. Eine flowers placed in small cairns, quiet prayers at sunset. The academic community, embarrassed by past suppressions, began to treat maritime folklore with renewed seriousness, and several islands once disregarded were surveyed with new technology. Some surveys found nothing. A few turned up anomalous stonework, faint runes, And in at least 2 cases, oral testimonies of elders who remembered tales their grandparents told about stones that hummed when the tide was low, yet not all questions were answered. The doorway's scrape marks indicated attempts to reopen the arch at later dates, decades later, perhaps by those who did not understand what they were doing. The bronze serpent remained missing from the official inventory. Its tiny hollow eyes, noted only in Innes's diary and then in the archaeologist's report as recovered fragments. The sound witnesses recalled Joseph Moore's earth whisper remained tantalizingly unquantified. Modern tests for infrasound yielded ambiguous results. The cliffs did produce low-frequency tones under certain wind conditions, tones that can induce dread and disorientation, but nothing in the instruments explained footprints ending in mid-mud or a stone warmed as if by a living hand. There is a last moral overlay to all of this, a psychological corollary that stretches back through the story like a dark current. Whether the event was engineered containment, communal sacrifice, or a misinterpreted natural phenomenon, what history reveals is a pattern of choices made by people who prioritized larger stability over individual lives. The Crown's early suppression, the engineer's sealed note, the laborer's punished curiosity all trace a willingness to hide discomforting truths in the service of a pragmatic calm. In that sense, the island's abandonment was as much social as physical. A community chose silence, then chronic forgetfulness, until the bones of the decision surfaced. Today, the lighthouse stands relit by automated systems, its beam indifferent and precise. Tourists sometimes pass the distant silhouette. The island is marked, but access is discouraged. On certain winter nights, locals admit, the sea still sounds like voices low, rhythmic, almost conversational. Though whether those are waves or memory, no instrument can say the final human question hangs, as it always has. Why do some truths remain buried? And who decides when the cost of unburying them is worth the suffering it will reveal? If you were Thomas Marshall, standing at the threshold between duty and dread, would you have sealed the door or opened it? Would you have listened to tradition, to science, to love? The island gives no easy answer. It only returns to the tide what the tide demands. If this story unsettled you, consider what else might be written in the margins of history: quiet decisions, buried rooms, choices made to keep the living calm.
If you want more investigations like this, subscribe for carefully sourced deep dives into the dark corners of our past. Like, share, and join the conversation below so these forgotten stories are not left to silence.